The rain had been steady for hours, the kind that soaks the earth and dulls the spirit. Outside, the streets of the small town were nearly deserted, with only the occasional car passing by, its tires hissing against the wet pavement. Inside James's diner, the scene was just as dreary. The once cozy booths, with their red vinyl seats now cracked and faded, stood empty. The hum of the fluorescent lights flickered unevenly, casting a pale, sickly glow over the space. James stood behind the counter, absently wiping down the same spot with a dish rag that had seen better days. His reflection stared back at him from the metal of the coffee machine. A man in his late 40s, with graying hair that had started to thin at the temples. The lines around his eyes and mouth spoke of years of worry and sleepless nights. His once bright blue eyes were now dulled by the burden of keeping the diner afloat, a place he had inherited from his father 10 years ago. Back then, it had been bustling, a staple of the town, known far and wide for its comforting food and, above all, its legendary fruit pie. That pie had been the pride of his father, a secret recipe passed down through generations. People would come from miles around just to have a slice. But that was years ago. Since then, competition from fast food chains and the advent of online food delivery had siphoned away the steady stream of customers. Now the diner was a ghost of its former self, barely scraping by. James sighed, tossing the dish rag aside. The bills were piling up, and with each passing day, the weight of failure pressed harder on his chest. He had tried everything. New menu items, promotions, even a brief flirtation with social media. But nothing seemed to work. He was just about ready to admit defeat, sell the place, and move on, though where to, he didn't know. The bell above the door jingled, breaking the monotony of his thoughts. James looked up, surprised to see someone actually coming in. It was an elderly woman, her silver hair neatly tied back in a bun. Her clothes simple but elegant, carrying an air of calm that seemed out of place in the damp, gloomy afternoon. "Afternoon," she said, her voice warm and friendly as she approached the counter. "Afternoon," James replied, forcing a smile. "What can I get for you?" "Just a cup of coffee, black, please," she said, settling herself onto one of the stools at the counter. Her eyes moved around the diner, taking in every detail before they settled on the old chalkboard menu hanging on the wall. The list of daily specials was written in James's hurried scrawl, but at the very bottom, in a space that had been erased and rewritten countless times, were the faint words, "Homemade fruit pie." James poured the coffee and set it in front of her. "Not many people order coffee these days," he said, trying to make small talk. "Sometimes the simplest things are the best," the woman replied, taking a sip. She savored it for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "This is good coffee." James couldn't help but chuckle. "You might be the only one who thinks so. We don't get much traffic anymore." The woman looked at him thoughtfully. "It's a shame. This place has good bones. It just needs a little something." James leaned against the counter, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" She pointed to the chalkboard. "That pie? Was it any good?" James smiled wistfully. "It was more than good. It was my father's recipe. People used to come from all over for a slice. But after he passed, I just couldn't seem to get it right. It was never the same." The woman nodded, as if she understood more than he was saying. "I've always believed that recipes carry memories, stories that are passed down with each ingredient. Maybe the pie just needs a bit of that story back." James shrugged, not sure what to say. "Maybe, but stories don't pay the bills." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "Maybe not, but they can bring people together. And sometimes that's what makes all the difference." For a moment, James found himself believing her, feeling a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in years. He shook it off, reminding himself that he was too old to believe in fairy tales. But as the woman took another sip of her coffee, she seemed to carry a quiet confidence, as if she knew something he didn't. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, placing a few crumpled bills on the counter. "I think I'll be back tomorrow if that's all right." "Of course," James said, surprised at how much he meant it. "I'll see you then." She gave him a nod and walked to the door, pausing for a moment to glance back at the chalkboard. Then she was gone, leaving James alone in the empty diner once more. But as he stood there, listening to the rain tapping against the windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The diner was still quiet, the bills were still unpaid, and the future was still uncertain. Yet for the first time in a long while, James felt a tiny spark of something, hope, perhaps, beginning to flicker in the dim corners of his heart. The next morning, the sky was clear, the rain clouds having drifted away, leaving the town refreshed but still quiet. James arrived at the diner early, more out of habit than necessity. He wasn't expecting much, just another day of cleaning tables, restocking supplies, and watching the clock tick away. But there was a slight change in his routine today, a sliver of anticipation brought on by the mysterious woman from the day before. Sure enough, just as the clock struck 10, the bell over the door jingled and Martha stepped in, her presence as calm and unhurried as it had been the previous day. James, who had been wiping down the counter, looked up and gave her a nod. "Good morning," Martha said, her smile warm and familiar. "Morning," James replied. "Back for more coffee?" Martha chuckled softly. "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about that pie recipe." James hesitated, the skepticism he had felt the day before creeping back. "The pie? I'm not sure what good it'll do. I've tried making it again and again, but it's just not the same." Martha walked over to the counter, setting her purse down gently before speaking. "I know you're skeptical, but I think I might be able to help. Sometimes it's not just the ingredients that make a recipe special. It's the care, the attention, and the love that go into it." James looked at her, the doubt clear in his eyes. "And you think you can bring all that back?" "I'd like to try," Martha said, her voice steady, "but I'll need your trust. Let's do this together. Your father's recipe, my touch." James rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the weight of his indecision. He had nothing to lose, but the idea of someone else tampering with his father's legacy made him uneasy. Yet, as he looked at Martha, he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just another passerby. She seemed genuinely invested, and there was a quiet confidence in her that was hard to ignore. "All right," James finally said, surprising even himself. "Let's give it a shot." Martha's face lit up with a smile. "Wonderful. I'll need to get a few things. Can you show me where you keep the ingredients?" James led her to the small kitchen in the back, where shelves lined the walls, stocked with the basics: flour, sugar, canned fruit, and other staples. Martha scanned the shelves, then shook her head gently. "This will do for now," she said, "but I'll need to bring in some fresh ingredients. There's a farmer's market in town, isn't there?" James nodded. "Yeah, just down the road." "Perfect. I'll be back shortly. In the meantime, could you dig out that old recipe? I'd love to see what your father wrote down." James watched as she left, a sense of unease mixed with a strange excitement stirring within him. He hadn't looked at the recipe in years. Not really. It was buried somewhere in the back of a drawer, along with other old papers and memories he had tried to keep at bay. But Martha's enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in a long while, James felt a flicker of hope. When Martha returned, she was carrying a basket filled with fresh fruits, plump, ripe peaches, blueberries that gleamed like tiny sapphires, and a few lemons that added a bright, citrusy scent to the air. She also had a small bundle of fresh herbs tied with twine, something James hadn't considered for the pie before. "Let's get started," Martha said, rolling up her sleeves with a practiced ease. They worked together in the kitchen, and James quickly realized that Martha was no amateur. She moved with a grace and precision that spoke of years of experience. She sifted the flour with care, mixed the dough until it was just right, and handled the fruit as if each piece were a treasure. James found himself drawn in, watching her every move, learning from her as she explained why she did things a certain way, why the dough needed just the right amount of chill, why the fruit had to be macerated with sugar to bring out its natural juices, and why a pinch of salt in the crust made all the difference. As they worked, Martha shared stories from her past, small snippets of her life that added layers to her character. She spoke of her mother, who had taught her to bake when she was just a child, and how those afternoons in the kitchen had been the highlight of her day. There was a tenderness in her voice as she recounted those memories, a love for the craft that had clearly been passed down through generations. James, in turn, found himself talking about his father, about how the diner had been his life's work, and how he had tried to honor that legacy but had always felt like he was falling short. Martha listened, her eyes full of understanding, never judging, only encouraging. By the time the first pie was ready to go into the oven, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of pride and anticipation. As the pie baked, filling the diner with a warm, sweet aroma, James and Martha sat at the counter, sipping coffee and talking like old friends. When the timer finally went off, James almost hesitated to take the pie out, afraid it wouldn't live up to the memory of what it once was. But as he placed the golden brown creation on the counter and saw the look of satisfaction on Martha's face, he knew they had done something right. "Let's see how it tastes," Martha said, slicing a piece and handing it to James. He took a bite, and for a moment he was transported back in time, back to the days when his father would stand in this very kitchen, laughing and chatting as he baked pies for the town. The taste was different from his father's, but in a way that was more alive, more vibrant, like the recipe had been brought back to life. "It's amazing," James said, barely able to believe it. Martha smiled, a look of quiet triumph on her face. "I'm glad you think so. I had a feeling this recipe just needed a little care." The first batch of pies sold out by the end of the day, with word quickly spreading through the town. Customers who hadn't stepped foot in the diner for years came back, drawn by the promise of a taste of the past. They sat at the booths, reminiscing about the old days, about James's father, and about the memories that had been tied to those pies. For the first time in years, the diner felt alive again, filled with laughter and conversation, the clinking of plates and silverware. And as James watched the scene unfold, he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to turn around. The days turned into weeks, and the once quiet, almost forgotten diner began to buzz with life. The aroma of freshly baked pies wafted out into the street, drawing in customers like a beacon. It wasn't long before word spread beyond the small town. People from neighboring areas started to make the trip, eager to try the pies that were quickly becoming legendary. James found himself working longer hours, but for the first time in years, he didn't mind. The diner was bustling, the cash register ringing with a frequency that had been a distant memory. Yet, it wasn't just the revival of the diner that had lifted his spirits. It was the growing friendship with Martha. They had developed a rhythm in the kitchen, an unspoken understanding that made their work seamless. But beyond that, there was a genuine connection, forged over shared stories and the simple act of creating something meaningful together. One evening, after the last customer had left and the diner was quiet again, James and Martha sat at the counter enjoying the stillness. Martha had insisted on making a pot of tea, a break from their usual coffee, and the two sipped from mismatched cups that had seen better days. "You've brought this place back to life," James said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I don't think I ever really thanked you for that." Martha smiled, her eyes softening with affection. "You did most of the work, James. I just gave you a little nudge." James shook his head. "It's more than that. You've got a gift, Martha. These pies. What you've done, it's special." Martha looked down at her tea, her expression growing more introspective. "Baking has always been a part of my life," she said quietly. "It's what I've known since I was a little girl. My mother taught me everything. She used to say that baking was a way of sharing love, of connecting with people. I suppose that's why I ended up making a career out of it." James leaned forward, curious. "You were a professional baker?" Martha nodded, a small, wistful smile playing on her lips. "Yes, I had a bakery in a big city. It was my pride and joy. We specialized in traditional recipes, passed down through generations, just like your father's pies. It was hard work, but I loved every minute of it." James could see the fondness in her eyes as she spoke, but he also noticed a flicker of something else, a shadow that crossed her face for the briefest moment. "So what brought you here?" he asked gently. "This town is a far cry from the city. Why leave something that meant so much to you?" Martha hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was tinged with a quiet sorrow. "It wasn't by choice. Not really. There was an incident, a fire. It destroyed the bakery, took everything I had worked for. And there was a tragedy. A life was lost." James felt a chill run down his spine. "A fire? That's terrible, Martha. I'm so sorry." Martha nodded, her gaze distant, as if she were looking at something far away. "The authorities investigated, of course. They found that it was an accident, a faulty wire. But by then the damage was done. The loss, the guilt, it was too much. The bakery was gone, and I couldn't bear to stay in the city where it all happened. So I left. I needed to start over, to find some peace. James felt a pang of sympathy, understanding now why Martha had been so hesitant to talk about her past. "And you chose this town?" Martha's smile returned, though it was tinged with sadness. "This town is quiet, peaceful. It felt like the right place to heal. And then I found your diner. I saw how much it meant to you, how much you were struggling. I thought maybe, in helping you, I could find a way to heal myself." James was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. He had seen the way she worked, the care she took with each pie, the way she poured her heart into everything she did. It made sense now. This was her way of finding closure, of moving on from the pain of her past. "You've done more than help," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given this place, and me, a second chance." Martha looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Maybe that's what we both needed, a second chance. The two sat in silence for a while, the bond between them deepening with each passing moment. But as the days went on and the diner's success continued to grow, James began to notice something unsettling. Whispers had started to circulate in town. Small, seemingly innocuous comments about Martha's past, about the fire and the tragedy. People who had once been thrilled to have the diner back in business now seemed more cautious, their smiles a little tighter, their conversations a little more guarded. James tried to ignore it at first, focusing on the work at hand, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. One afternoon, as James was cleaning up after the lunch rush, a regular customer, Mrs. Thompson, lingered by the counter. She was an older woman, always kind, with a penchant for gossip. "James," she said, her voice low, "you know, people are talking about Martha." James looked up, his heart sinking. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thompson leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They're saying she's hiding something, that she left the city because of that fire, but no one really knows the full story. Some folks think there's more to it." James felt a surge of anger and protectiveness. "Martha's been nothing but kind and helpful. She's the reason this place is still standing." Mrs. Thompson nodded, though her expression remained concerned. "I know, James, but people are wary. They don't like mysteries, especially in a small town like this." James thanked her and watched as she left, a heavy weight settling on his chest. The success of the diner was everything he had hoped for, but the idea that it might be built on secrets and half-truths gnawed at him. He trusted Martha. She had been open with him about her past, and he believed in her sincerity. But now doubt had crept in, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there might be more to the story than she had let on. That evening, after the diner had closed and the silence of the night settled in, James found himself staring at the old recipe book that had once belonged to his father. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but it was a symbol of trust, of legacy. He thought about Martha, about the way she had revived the diner, and the way they had worked together to bring something beautiful back to life. But the whispers wouldn't leave his mind. He knew he needed to talk to her, to ask her directly about what had happened, to clear the air before things got worse. It wasn't just the diner's reputation at stake. It was their friendship, the trust they had built. As the clock ticked on, James made up his mind. Tomorrow he would confront Martha, not out of suspicion, but out of a need for truth. He owed it to her and to himself to understand the full story. Whatever happened, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. The diner hummed with the familiar sounds of clinking dishes and low conversations, the scent of freshly baked pies lingering in the air. It was another busy afternoon, and James found himself both grateful for the resurgence of business and burdened by the growing unease in his chest. The whispers had not ceased. If anything, they had grown louder, more insistent. The joy he once felt seeing the diner filled with customers was now tinged with anxiety, the rumors about Martha gnawing at the back of his mind. James watched Martha from across the room as she chatted with a group of customers, her smile warm and genuine. She had become a fixture in the diner, as much a part of its revival as the pies themselves. Yet as he looked at her now, the doubts that had been festering within him finally reached a boiling point. He knew he had to confront her, to hear the truth from her own lips, no matter how difficult it might be. As the afternoon crowd thinned and the diner began to quiet down, James took a deep breath and approached Martha, who was wiping down the counter with her usual meticulous care. "Martha," he began, his voice low and hesitant, "could we talk for a moment?" Martha looked up, her expression immediately concerned. "Of course, James. Is everything all right?" James gestured toward one of the booths in the back, away from prying ears. "Let's sit down." They moved to the booth, the tension between them palpable. Martha folded her hands on the table, waiting for James to speak. He struggled to find the right words, his mind racing with the conflicting emotions that had been building for days. "Martha," he started again, this time more firmly, "there's something I need to ask you about. It's about your past, about the bakery you told me about." Martha's face remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a flicker of apprehension. "What about it?" James hesitated, then plunged ahead. "There have been rumors going around about the fire. People are saying you were involved, that there was more to it than what you told me." Martha's expression tightened, and she looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke. "I knew this day would come. I was hoping it wouldn't, but I suppose you deserve to know the truth." James watched her, his heart pounding. He wanted to believe in her, to trust the bond they had built, but the uncertainty was like a weight pressing down on him. Martha took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before she began. "The fire was a terrible accident, James. It destroyed everything I had worked for, and yes, a life was lost that night. A young woman who worked at the bakery. She was caught in the fire. I still think about her every day." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. James remained silent, giving her the space to continue. "The investigation was thorough," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly. "The authorities found that the fire was caused by a faulty electrical wire. It wasn't anyone's fault, but that didn't stop people from pointing fingers. I was the owner, the one responsible for everything that happened in that bakery. And in their grief, people needed someone to blame." She looked up at James, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I was accused of negligence, of not maintaining the building properly. The media made a spectacle of it, and the community turned against me. Even after I was cleared of any wrongdoing, the damage was done. My reputation was in ruins, and the guilt, it was unbearable. That's why I left. I couldn't stay there, not after everything that had happened." James felt a surge of sympathy for Martha, but it was quickly overshadowed by the doubts that had been gnawing at him. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. "I didn't want to burden you with my past, especially when you were struggling so much with the diner. I hoped that by starting over here, I could leave it all behind, that maybe I could do some good and find a bit of peace." James was silent, his mind reeling. He wanted to trust her, to believe that she had been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. But the rumors, the whispers, they had planted a seed of doubt that was hard to ignore. "I don't know what to think, Martha," he admitted, his voice strained. "This diner is everything to me, and I've worked so hard to bring it back. I can't afford to let anything jeopardize that." Martha's face crumpled, the pain in her eyes unmistakable. "I understand, James. I wouldn't want to be the cause of any more trouble for you. If you think it's best that I leave, I will." James felt a pang of guilt at the thought of her leaving. She had become more than just a business partner. She had become a friend, someone who had helped him rediscover his passion for the diner and for life itself. But the fear of losing everything he had worked for was overwhelming. "I need time to think," James said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "I just need to figure out what's best for the diner." Martha nodded, her expression resigned. "I understand. Take all the time you need." She stood up, leaving James alone in the booth, his thoughts swirling in a tumultuous mix of doubt, guilt, and fear. The diner that had once been a source of joy and pride now felt like a burden, the success tainted by the uncertainty of the truth. As the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened in the empty diner, James sat alone, grappling with the burden of truth. He knew he had a decision to make, one that would not only determine the future of the diner, but also the future of his friendship with Martha. The next few days were a blur of conflicting emotions for James. The diner continued to thrive, but the joy that had once filled him was overshadowed by the weight of his decision. The rumors about Martha persisted, and the unease in town grew, making the once bustling diner feel like a stage for whispered judgments. James knew he couldn't avoid the issue any longer. He had to make a choice. Early one morning, before the sun had fully risen, James stood alone in the kitchen. The silence was heavy, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall. He thought about everything that had happened since Martha walked into his diner. The way she had breathed new life into the place, the way she had rekindled his passion for baking, and the way she had become not just a business partner, but a true friend. The doubts still lingered, but as he stood there surrounded by the tools and ingredients that had become so familiar, he realized something important. Martha had given him more than just a successful diner. She had given him hope, a sense of purpose, and the courage to face his fears. Without her, he would have lost the diner long ago. And more than that, he would have lost himself. With renewed resolve, James made up his mind. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He had to stand by Martha, not just because of what she had done for the diner, but because it was the right thing to do. He knew that defending her would come with risks, that the rumors could drive customers away, and that he might lose everything he had worked for. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face those risks head-on. Later that morning, as the diner began to fill with its usual mix of locals and out-of-town visitors, James spotted Martha in the kitchen, quietly preparing the dough for the day's pies. He walked over to her, his heart pounding with the weight of what he was about to do. "Martha," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've made a decision. I want you to stay. I need you to stay. This diner isn't just about the food, it's about the people, and you're a part of that now. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Martha looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and relief. "James, are you sure? After everything that's been said?" James nodded firmly. "I'm sure. We've come too far to let fear tear us apart. You've given me a second chance, and I want to give you the same. Besides, I've been thinking, we need to create something new, something that represents both of us, and what this diner has become. A new dessert, a combination of our recipes." Martha's expression softened, and a slow smile spread across her face. "A new dessert. I think that's a wonderful idea, James. A recipe for redemption." They spent the rest of the day working together, experimenting with different ingredients and techniques. The kitchen was filled with the sounds of laughter and the clinking of utensils as they blended their ideas, pouring their hearts into every step. They combined the rich, fruity sweetness of James's father's pie recipe with the delicate, refined flavors that Martha had mastered over her years as a professional baker. The result was a creation that was both familiar and innovative, a dessert that told the story of their journey together. When the first batch was ready, James and Martha stood back and admired their work. The dessert, a layered pie with a crisp, buttery crust filled with a mixture of spiced fruits and topped with a light citrusy glaze, was beautiful, a perfect blend of their styles. It was more than just a dish. It was a symbol of healing, of second chances, and of the power of friendship. They named it the Redemption Pie and decided to introduce it that evening during the diner's busiest hours. James knew it was a gamble, but he also knew that it was a chance worth taking. As evening fell, the diner filled with its usual crowd, along with a few new faces who had heard about the recent success. James felt a mixture of nerves and excitement as he and Martha prepared to unveil the new dessert. When the time came, James stepped out from behind the counter and addressed the diners, his voice strong and clear. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his eyes sweeping over the room. "This diner has been a part of this town for as long as I can remember, and it means the world to me to see it thriving again. But I couldn't have done it alone. Martha has been a huge part of that success, and together we've created something new, something that represents not just our partnership, but the spirit of this place. We call it the Redemption Pie, and we hope you enjoy it." The response was immediate. The diners clapped, some out of curiosity, others out of loyalty. As the first slices of the Redemption Pie were served, there was a hush as people took their first bites. James watched anxiously, his heart in his throat, until he began to see the smiles, hear the murmurs of approval, and finally the enthusiastic requests for more. Word of the new dessert spread quickly, and within days the diner was busier than ever. The Redemption Pie became a sensation, drawing attention not just from neighboring towns, but from food critics and bloggers who were eager to try the dish and learn its story. The diner's reputation soared, and with it, the whispers about Martha began to fade, replaced by admiration for her skill and resilience. In the end, Martha's past was fully revealed, but rather than driving people away, it drew them closer. The town, once wary of her, came to see her not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a testament to the power of perseverance and the possibility of redemption. Martha and James, now closer than ever, continued to run the diner together, their friendship stronger for the trials they had faced. The diner, once on the brink of closure, had become a symbol of second chances, a place where people could come not just for a meal, but for a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there is always hope. And as James and Martha worked side by side, they knew that their story, like the redemption pie, was far from over. It was just the beginning of something truly special.